We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You have to let it all go, Neo. Fear, doubt, and disbelief. Free your mind.
I just want to make an impact, a positive impact on as many people as possible.
You gotta want to succeed as bad as you want to breathe.
When you're down, you might feel like you want to give up. Don't stop. Keep moving. Keep breathing.
There's a war on consciousness in our society.
There is an awakeness, an awareness that sees it all. And it's in you too. It's in all of us.
We have to stop consuming our culture. We have to create culture.
This is the G and Coletti Show.
Let's begin.
On this episode of the G and Coletti Show, we have none other than the legendary Graham Hancock. I've been religiously following him for the last few years, and I finally got the opportunity to meet him. In addition to being a best-selling writer, he is also a man of integrity who is speaking his truth no matter what stands in his way. He has made some groundbreaking discoveries about the true history of our current existence. Oh, and how could I forget? He also had a TED Talk censored about psychedelics and the war on consciousness that ended up going mega viral on the internet.
And on today's episode, we're going to focus on the work from his most recent book, Magicians of the Gods, the much anticipated sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. He presents brand new and compelling evidence which backs up his theories of a meteor impact that decimated the Earth, along with an advanced civilization approximately 11,800 years ago. Now, why is this so fascinating? Mainstream historians say the Egyptians were the first advanced civilization, which is only 5,000 years ago. That's a huge discrepancy from Graham's groundbreaking discovery.
We originally teamed up with our friends Patrick and Kadena from the Conspiracy Culture bookstore here in Toronto to organize a Graham Hancock event. And I'll admit they definitely did most of the organizing. And wow, what a turnout. Not only did he present for 2 hours straight, but also after the show he met every single fan who waited in line in the freezing rain to get an autograph or picture and a few words with Graham. What an amazing guy. And after all of that, like 7 or 8 hours in total, he still came down to sit with us for a quick interview. We got a few questions in for a psychedelic mini-doc we're working on, which he seemed overly enthusiastic about, and he agreed to continue the rest of the interview over Skype at a later date. Well, that later date just happened, and now we're going to share our interview with you. But before we get started, if it's your first time listening, I just want to give a quick intro into who we are and what the podcast is all about. I'm G, one half of the G and Coletti Show.
Hey guys, I'm Coletti, and thanks for tuning in. Just to give you guys an idea of what we're all about here at the G and Coletti Show, we're going to be exposing you to the latest and greatest minds that are changing the way you view the world, each other, and yourself. From biohacking to psychedelics to being motivated and optimizing your everyday life, you will not find the ideas and information covered in this podcast anywhere else.
So sit back, relax, enjoy the show, and please, we'd love to hear from you guys. If you have any comments or criticisms or just ideas, you can send us an email at gandcoletti@collective-evolution.com.
Now, let me be honest with you guys. Graham Hancock and his theories are completely new to me, and this interview gets more and more intriguing as things go on. We asked Graham to touch on some interesting evidence of a past civilization that were more advanced than our own and that were decimated by a cataclysmic event. Also, the likelihood of another comet hitting the Earth and what the end-of-day scenario may look like. According to Graham, the threat seems to be real, friends. But before we get to the possible future, we need to start with the past.
So it's supposed to go like this, okay? That about 6 million years ago, you have the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee and human beings. And then those two lines begin to diverge.
Then at about 2.5 million years ago is where we find the first stone tools, so evidence of early humans making tools.
200,000 years ago, we saw the first anatomically modern man with a modern brain, but no civilization.
Our ancestors are simple hunter-gatherers, and their behavior is actually rather archaic. They're not very creative or inventive. Round about 100,000 years ago, things begin to change, and our ancestors start using symbols.
And at around 40,000 years ago is when we start seeing intricate cave art showing up in different caves around the world.
11,000 years ago, we see our first signs of modern agriculture.
Also around that same time were the first monuments and megaliths that started coming up. And it was also when we started seeing a surplus in agriculture, which allowed cities to be formed.
City and the word civilization are actually linked. They're connected. So this is regarded as the beginning of civilization, about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, although you can perhaps trace it back to 11,500 years ago.
So that's the mainstream version of our timeline in a nutshell. Graham's new research is saying a little bit of a different story, and there was a lot more that happened in the last at least 10,000 years, maybe more.
I think there's serious problems with this timeline. First of all, anatomically modern humans may have emerged earlier than 200,000 years ago. We can't say for sure.
So the oldest modern human remains is 200,000 years old.
And these are the only ones that were found. Who knows what else there could be still sitting out there somewhere.
Secondly, it's really bizarre that once we've attained anatomical modernity and we have the modern human brain, that we wait 195,000 years before we establish the first civilizations, because that's the view, that it's 195,000 years later, 5,000 years ago, that we get the first civilizations. I think civilization started much earlier than that. But I think we can constrain the period in which it began. I don't think it started earlier than about 70,000 years ago. And the reason I say that is that there was a global cataclysm 70,000 years ago.
He's referring to the Mount Toba eruption, a giant supervolcano that erupted in Indonesia about 70,000 years ago.
The ash clouded out the sun, and the Earth went into an ice age. It carpeted the entire atmosphere of the Earth in poisonous fumes, and it's believed that only 2,000 people survived.
It almost caused human extinction.
Okay, so to me, that's the earliest point that we can begin to talk, because the whole human population was just reduced to a few individuals at that point. So I think civilization began after that, and maybe that knock on the head, that cataclysmic event of the Mount Toba eruption, was a factor in that. And I think that we've lost a whole episode of human civilization in that period from 70,000 years ago. And I believe, as you know, if you've read my book, Magicians of the Gods, that a series of further cataclysms, this time involving comet impacts with the Earth, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, wiped out almost all traces of that earlier civilization and left us in the record with only evidence of hunter-gatherers and myths and traditions that suggest something else. And this is what I've spent the last 25 years digging into, is what that something else might be and how it might be explained.
Yeah, the something else sounds interesting to me too. You know, knowing our true history, there's no real way to know how far back civilization can go, because each cataclysm will create, a further cover over what was left behind. But what we do know, and what most scientists will agree, or some scientists are now agreeing, is that 12,900 years ago, a comet came and destroyed most civilization that was there, and also caused massive melting of the polar cap, probably landed somewhere in North America, and sent everything into haywire.
And about 1,000 years later, approximately 11,800 years ago, there was a second comet. Now, the hypothesis is that it hit the ocean. It melted the glaciers, and it rose sea levels approximately 400 feet. Now, the warm water vapor went into the atmosphere and thus created a greenhouse effect around the Earth, and this snapped us out of the Ice Age.
Yeah, it warmed things up and pretty much set the tone for the next 10,000 years. It wasn't until, like I said, 5,000 years ago when we see the Egyptians come out of nowhere and have this advanced civilization, or somewhat advanced. Now, the sea levels rising 400 feet is a really interesting point to keep in mind, which will take us into our next topic, is that how advanced were they if they were wiped out at the time that they were wiped out? If it's an advanced civilization, what kind of technology do they have? Or what kind of proof is there?
I'm very intrigued by the accounts of ancient flying machines. I don't rule out the possibility that the former civilization that was wiped out between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago had sufficiently advanced technology to make flying machines. I don't rule that out, but I don't waste a lot of space talking about that, because the evidence for that is actually very flimsy and rooted and grounded in a few accounts and traditions in a number of ancient texts. Those are very interesting ancient texts. I don't want to dismiss them, but I wouldn't want to bet my life on them either.
I probably wouldn't bet my life on them, but I have to say they're very compelling and interesting. Some of the stories include the Babylonian mythology, the laws of Halkatha, the Epic of Etana that speak about flying machines. Greek mythology talks about the story of Icarus. You'll find Vimanas in Indian mythology, which are flying machines. There's also engravings in the Temple of Seti that look like helicopters and spaceships, and zoomorphic models from Egypt and South America all point to some sort of advanced technology, or at least insinuate that it could be.
Listen, these are very interesting theories, but much like Graham says, it makes more sense to focus on things that, as he puts it, are entrenched in science. Right now, to me, it's just these are cool ideas to consider, but let's not mix fact from possibility.
I want to stick with things that I can prove and demonstrate. And one thing I can prove and demonstrate is that way back during the Ice Age, way back between 70,000 years ago and 12,800 years ago, when sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today, somebody mapped the world. Somebody explored the entire globe, measured the Earth, knew its dimensions accurately, and left images of the Earth as it looked during the last Ice Age. This speaks of a high level of civilization. We're supposed in the last Ice Age to have, that human beings are only supposed to have been primitive hunter-gatherers, nomadic tribes dressed in skins, hunting rabbits or mammoths if they were particularly adventurous. They're not supposed to have been out there in great ships that are capable of navigating the entire Earth, creating accurate maps of the Earth with accurate longitudes and latitudes. But we have evidence in ancient maps, which I've gone into in depth in a number of my books, which suggests strongly that such a mapping project was undertaken.
We were only able to map out the world accurately in and around the 1700s. That's when the chronometer was invented, and this is needed to accurately measure time at sea, thus giving us accurate longitudes.
The other interesting point about the Pierre Reese maps is that they outline Antarctica. The reason this is interesting is because it was only until the 20th century that we had the ability to see under the ice with satellite technology and to determine what its real outline was. And it was exactly the same as those maps.
So to find accurate longitudes that were set down more than 12,000 years ago on maps that actually show the world as it looked during the last Ice Age speaks of a level of civilization that was at least as high as our civilization in the late 18th century, at a time when our ancestors are supposed to have been simple and primitive hunter-gatherers. There is so much detailed mathematics, so much detailed astronomy comes down in the ancient traditions. This is not a story about a flying machine. This is accurate measurements of numbers, of the mathematics involved in obscure astronomical processes that we ourselves as a civilization have only begun to measure accurately in the last 100 years or so. We find these numbers in ancient myths passed down from ancient times. That's a lot more compelling to me than an account of somebody flying in a flying machine. The flying machine may be true, but the mathematics, the astronomy is definitely true. And that speaks of a high level of civilization.
Yeah, I agree. I'd say the Pierre Reese maps are solid proof of a lost civilization.
I wonder what other evidence there is that suggests an advanced technology.
Extraordinary and anomalous megalithic sites, of which the oldest we now know of in the world is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a series of huge stone circles that are absolutely 11,600 years old, and that tell us that somebody at that time, and 11,600 years ago was immediately after the cataclysm that I write about in Magicians of the Gods, that somebody at that time was capable of organizing a labor force, a large labor force, feeding that labor force, laying out a site with perfect alignments to true north, south, east, and west, and moving megaliths that weigh up to 50 tons. This in itself is completely unexpected in a hunter-gatherer population 11,600 years ago. It just doesn't make sense. And we find that this theme goes on all around the world, that there was an ancient knowledge of the moving and manipulation of very large pieces of stone. And why stone? Stone seems like such a primitive thing, but actually stone is what lasts. Stone is what survives. Stone is why the Great Pyramid is still sitting there thousands of years after it was made, and why our skyscrapers and the constructions of our modern civilization will not be standing thousands of years from now, because they're held up by metal. Stone is a very durable thing, and it's clear to me that there was an ancient science of the manipulation and management of stone. When you look at feats like moving blocks weighing in excess of 1,000 tons, as we find at Baalbek. I mean, 1,000 tons, to put it in perspective, that's 500 large SUVs, okay, in one block. 500 large SUVs just lifted up 30 or 40 feet above the ground thousands of years ago by an unknown people, as though it were easy, just something you could do at the drop of a hat. And we see this again and again. We see essentially the same extraordinary feats repeated all around the world. And I think that is evidence of a lost technology.
So one of these rocks are the size of 500 large SUVs. I'm not sure why that's such a big deal. How do we know that they didn't have some kind of hack to move rocks, and why is moving rocks make you so advanced?
What kind of hack are you thinking? 1 million people? I think it's
a million people, or maybe they found. I've seen things on TV where they have logs and they put them underneath. I don't know if that works with 500 tons, but
I think that personally, I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's evidence that they had to have something that was more advanced to move these things, especially when they're talking 12,000 years ago, before we have any way to explain who did that, as in Göbekli Tepe.
And I find it interesting that if they can mold rocks, perhaps they didn't move large rocks. All they did is learn how to attach smaller rocks together to make a giant rock.
I think you're referring to Sacsayhuaman.
Saxe what?
Sacsayhuaman.
Sacsayhuaman?
I think that's a proper way. In near Cusco in South America, basically these show molded rocks, or it seems like they were molded. And after that, the more modern megaliths in the area are way less advanced than those. So somehow the technology or method they were using was lost.
So some past civilizations could move big rocks and others could move bigger rocks. That's a cool FYI. I just think the real value in these findings is how fragile our existence may be.
So as I say, the backup to what I'm saying is in Magicians of the Gods. But the first and key point is that what I'm putting before the public in Magicians of the Gods is material that previously has been confined entirely to the rarefied air of scientific journals. And that material demonstrates, in my view, beyond any doubt, that the Earth went through a gigantic series of cataclysms between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. This is right in the backyard of what we've been taught is history. But the history that we're taught has not taken account of these cataclysmic events. Okay? Once we understand that a cataclysmic event on the scale that made the dinosaurs extinct 65 million years ago, an extinction level event, occurred as recently as 11,600 years ago, then the whole sense of our security as a civilization, the whole sense that we have an endless future stretching ahead of us that we may simply take for granted, that is badly shaken up by the evidence of a gigantic global cataclysm as recently as 11,600 years ago. And then secondly, the evidence that a high civilization went down in that cataclysm. This has huge lessons for us. Previously, we have regarded ourselves as what the human story has been all about. Now we discover that there was an advanced civilization before, that all these technical achievements that we're so proud of, certainly the technical achievements up to the 1900s at any rate, that we're so proud of, had been repeated before. They'd happened earlier. A civilization had reached that level before, and it was brought down in a cataclysm. This should require us to take the gift of life seriously as something very precious and wonderful and amazing that the universe has put our way. We should not be proud and arrogant in our own achievements. We should always regard them as contingent and temporary, and we should do the very best we can to live in harmony with one another and with the universe. I think it would change the whole outlook of humanity completely if we understood this, that we are not the first high civilization, that this has happened before, and that all the gifts and benefits of civilization that we take so much for granted can be stripped away from us in, as Plato said, a single terrible day and night.
So I guess finding out we could be wiped out at any minute is important, and it would affect our consciousness. It's almost like finding out you only have a few days left to live. What would you do differently? How would that change your life if you could die at any time? Would we waste time on war and fighting? What would we do differently?
I believe it would have a universal humbling effect on humanity, and it would also remind us that we are all human. That's actually what we have in common, because a comet actually doesn't really care if you're a Muslim or a Christian. or a Buddhist or a Hindu. The damage it does is the same anyway. We're all human beings. We all share an interest in a future for our children on this earth, and our petty squabbles and fights amongst one another on the basis of race or religion or ideology just go away completely when you understand that this very precious gift of life itself can be taken away from us in an instant.
Yeah, like we are so divided in this day and age, and we have borders separating countries, and we're even separated by little things like race, religion, and gender. And we don't stop there. As an Italian, I noticed that Italy is really divided into north and south. Then all the southern provinces, they're separated and prejudiced against each other. Then it's separated by town, and even streets take issue with each other. And eventually, families end up splitting and dividing until you're by yourself and you're not able to divide or isolate any longer. And I wonder if this knowledge that proves that life is a gift that may be taken away at any second by a comet's impact might unite us and help us realize that we're all in this thing together.
That's an amazing way of putting it, Anth. And, if imaginary lines can separate us, can a comet impact really bring us back together?
I've been saying for 25 years that we're a species with amnesia. And one of the functions of amnesia is that haunting sense of loss, that feeling that something's missing, that we're not getting the whole picture. And what I find is that feeling is very widespread around the world. And mainstream archaeology and history seems to be trying to hold the flood back, to stop that feeling. But that feeling, I think, is really important. I think that's part of the awakening of the human race. It's part of awakening from slumber into full knowledge. That's the process that we're engaged in at the moment. It's extremely difficult and painful, and part of it is this haunting sense of loss, that we don't have our full story, and we need to have it.
That's such an interesting way of analyzing this situation. It's almost like an orphan finding out who their parents are. Before finding out, they'd probably be confused, not knowing who they are, where they came from, what their true identity is.
That's interesting because I used to listen to a motivational video, and it always got me thinking. It said that imagine you were in a coma, and when you woke up, they told you that you were a Navy SEAL and they needed you right back in the force. And how would you be different as opposed to waking up and people telling you, say, you were a pianist or a violinist? The point of the story is that the past has a huge impact on who you are. And I think we should all be more knowledgeable when it comes to knowing our true past.
Speaking of our true past, an interesting discovery was made in the 1990s that might tell us a little bit more about our true history. It's a site called Göbekli Tepe.
Göbekli what? Göbekli Tepe? Gee, I don't know if where he's coming up with this stuff, guys, if it's real or not. But
it's real.
I don't know if these are real places or just...
It's a place in Turkey. It's real. It's called Göbekli Tepe.
Okay.
And it's been scientifically dated to about 12,000 years ago. So we're talking at least 6,000 years before the Egyptians. But on top of being such a great discovery, Graham thinks it might even be actually trying to forewarn us about something.
Göbekli Tepe is a megalithic site. Megalith meaning large stones. And one of those pillars, which is pillar 43 in enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe, has an extraordinary illustration on it, carved in high relief, which means that they cut away the stone and left the bits standing proud from the stone that they wanted to focus upon. And what I go into in Magicians of the Gods is the suggestion that image on that stone is showing a picture of the sky, that the various animals shown on the stone, which prominently has an image of the sun in the center of it, are actually constellation images, just as we project imaginary images onto groups of stars in the sky. So this was done in antiquity. And when we identify those constellations, and the presence of the sun in this carving at Göbekli Tepe helps us to do that, what we find is that it's a picture of the sky in our time. It's a picture of the sky today at a very specific moment, at the winter solstice, 21st of December, roughly for 3 or 4 days around the winter solstice. At the moment, the sun sits astride the dark rifts in the Milky Way at the center of our galaxy as viewed from Earth between the constellations of Sagittarius and Scorpio. And that is the picture that's shown on this pillar at Göbekli Tepe, a picture not of the sky 11,600 years ago, but of the sky today in our time. And that's why I think Göbekli Tepe is a time capsule. And that's why I think it does contain a message for us, a message written in the language of astronomy. And that message is, these are my words, not some inscription. Pay attention to that sky. Pay attention to that sky.
Now, I know one thing or two about paying attention to warnings. If my wife gives me a warning and I don't pay attention, I can expect a cataclysm right around the corner. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, I second that. Listen, I wish I would have been more observant when it comes to looking into signs into the past, into my past. The thing is, the signs are always there, and it's up to us to figure out these riddles or suffer the consequences.
So the reconstructed evidence goes as follows. There was a giant comet that entered the Earth's or the inner solar system about 20,000 years ago, and it was approximately 100 to 200 kilometers in diameter. And it got trapped in the orbit and started breaking up into fragments. Some of these fragments actually hit Jupiter, about 20 of them or so, in 1994. You can check that up on the internet.
And these comets stay on an orbit that crosses the orbit of the Earth twice a year, specifically in June and November. Now, this is called the Taurid meteor stream. So basically, it's the smaller fragments of the giant comet, and this is the same ones that hit the Earth 12,900 years ago and 11,800 years ago that changed the history of civilization.
And indeed, it is the case that a group of astronomers, Victor Klube, Bill Napier in particular, have been seeking for about 20 years to draw attention to the Taurid meteor stream and to point out that it's actually really dangerous and that it isn't just filled with dust that makes pretty shooting stars, that there are actually huge objects still sitting in the Taurid meteor stream, the remnants of the original giant comet that did so much damage between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And their calculations are that we're going to cross an area of the Taurid meteor stream during the next 30 years where we are in danger of encountering some of those large objects. So when I find that message coming from 21st century astronomers and carved on a pillar in an 11,600-year-old megalithic site, I think it's time to pay attention.
Yeah, we should pay attention. That's kind of freaky when you think about it. I really wonder what the day of impact would have been like.
The effect of these things is a global firestorm, winds running in the hundreds of kilometers per hour, superheated winds, forests on a continent-wide scale going on fire, giant tsunamis rolling across the oceans. It really is almost impossible to imagine and describe the effects of a series of impacts of 1 mile wide objects, and that's what appears to have happened 12,800 years ago. When you have an object that's a mile wide, entering the Earth's atmosphere at 70,000 miles an hour, which is what fragments of a comet do, and colliding with the Earth, you have an explosion which would dwarf the entire nuclear arsenal of the Earth, all going off at once. It's really hard for people to imagine the amount of kinetic energy that is released in these cosmic impacts. I believe the first impact, 12,800 years ago, came as a complete surprise. And I think that they took apart but did not completely destroy the lost civilization that I've been focusing my work on for the past 25 years. I think that elements of that civilization lasted down until 11,600 years ago, and that's when the double whammy happened. That's when the second series of impacts occurred. That's the date that Plato gives for the submergence of Atlantis, 11,600 years before our time, 9,000 years before the time of Solon.
Yeah, the Plato connection is so interesting that these dates are, linked so closely. But the description of the cataclysm, that just totally blows my mind.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely insane. I know that more and more people are getting concerned with this end of the world scenario. Even Costco's taking notice, and for the bargain price of $10,000, you can get a full stacked skid of buckets of slop that store well, and they are the equivalent of a few thousand meals. Now, I know G has a bit of this paranoia. Are you prepared?
Oh, well, I used to. 2012, I was getting a little bit of the prepper stage, but I wouldn't be prepared for this. It's not like Y2K. This is, you got to build a bunker and be prepared to live underground probably for, years. Who knows how long? And maybe that's what you see, these underground tunnels and some of these conspiracy circles are building, the US military is building bases underground. Maybe this is what they're getting ready for. Who knows?
Every ancient tradition that speaks of a former civilization, of a former golden age, and of the destruction of that civilization by cataclysm, and there are thousands of such traditions, every one of those traditions implicates humanity in our own destruction, that our own behavior has been part of what has brought the wrath of the universe down upon us, that we did not learn the lessons. It's the ringing phrase of Plato's describing the lost civilization of Atlantis, which was once beautiful and pure, generous and devoted to spirit, but became over-attached to matter, became arrogant and cruel and proud, began to project its power around the world. And Plato tells us that it had ceased to wear its prosperity with moderation. It was this hubris, this exaggerated pride coupled with arrogance that ultimately led to the destruction of Atlantis in Plato's story. So, we are taught in modern science to regard the universe as a dead thing. It's just matter to be mined and exploited for economic purposes. But the ancients saw the universe as ensouled, as filled with life and filled with meaning. Okay, and humanity is part of that universe. And if we rebel against the principles of harmony and love that are the true principles that run this universe, if we rebel against those principles so hard, if we seek to turn everything upside down, to create a world filled with violence and hatred, and project our own egos into that world, then we can expect the world to not appreciate what we're doing, and pay a price. We can pay a price for that. But I think that, the message of the ancient myths is we need to wake up to consciousness. We need to wake up to taking responsibility for our own choices and our own decisions, and ultimately to recognize our unity as a human family.
Come to think of it, maybe a comet thread is what we actually need to realize our unity as a human family. With peace at hand, we could easily redirect money spent on war to a comet defense system that could actually save our civilization. Since everything in the universe is cyclical, could it possibly be that comets are like a self-regulating reset button? Like when we get out of control, it brings us right back to the start, saying, you know what, we messed up, but let's start it over again. If that is the case, then it only makes sense that peace is the answer to save us. So on behalf of the G and Coletti Show, I'd like to thank you. And we'd love to hear from you guys. If you guys want to send us an email with some feedback or comments or who you want on the show, you can send us an email at gandcoletti@collective-evolution.com. And you can follow us on Instagram at G and Coletti.